Welcome to our podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction about the Middle Ages." Today's episode, Medieval Chivalry. Is it dead or alive? Hi, I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels, and the answer is, medieval chivalry is dead. It's passed on. It is no more. It has ceased to be. It has kicked the bucket. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. Next week what I'm doing now is channeling the Monty Python Search for the Holy Grail video game, in which the first screen announces no refunds. The second screen has Collect the Grail as an option. Click on Collect the Grail, and this is what you get.
Congratulations, you won! Oh, jolly well done. Good show. We do hope you've enjoyed the game. Goodbye.
Now that I got that out of my system, I'd like to introduce my co-host for this episode, and also my partner for life, Ellen Harrison Abels. Ellen is literally the reason I became a medieval historian. Elle, would you like to tell our listeners how that happened?
When Richard and I met in a Bronze Age history course, actually we met during the SDS strike in 1971. I'm the only person I know who owes my marriage to the SDS. I was a medieval history major at Barnard, and he was studying American history at Columbia with the intention of going to law school. I loved medieval history, and I suggested he take a class with my advisor, Dr. Wempel. He did, and ended up as a medieval historian. Meanwhile, I became the lawyer in the family.
It's our own personal version of the O. Henry story, The Gift of the Magi.
Considering that if we had both become historians, we never would have gotten jobs within 1,000 miles of each other, I think it worked out for the best. And I still love medieval history.
And so do I. So we're going to tell you today about medieval chivalry.
Were you serious when you said that chivalry is dead? Or was that just another Monty Python reference?
I'm completely serious about medieval chivalry being dead. It outlasted the Middle Ages, but it expired centuries ago. I'm waffling a bit because medieval chivalry and what most people think chivalry is are two different things.
I remember years ago you got a surprise email from the New York Times asking you to join in an online debate about chivalry.
Yeah, I was even more surprised than you that the Times was interested in chivalry or even knew who I was. The question was, should chivalry die, be brought back, or evolve into a more inclusive ethos that is appropriate for today? They asked 6 of us to comment. The others were journalists and bloggers. I was the token academic historian. The others debated whether gentlemanly and protective attitudes and behavior toward women were respectful and to be encouraged, or condescending and based on outdated gender assumptions. I was the outlier. Obviously, I recognized the popular conception of chivalry as the actions of a gentleman. Sir Walter Raleigh sacrificing his cloak so Queen Elizabeth wouldn't get her feet muddied. I also understood that this is what the New York Times editors meant when they asked this question. But as a slightly pedantic medieval historian...
Slightly?
Okay, a bit more than slightly. Nonetheless, as an academic medieval historian, I had to take exception. When I think of chivalry, it is medieval chivalry. And that was an aristocratic ethos designed to distinguish the self-defined military nobility of medieval Europe from those whom they considered their social inferiors, especially rich merchants with pretensions. Medieval chivalry combined the virtues of the knight as a warrior, that is, skill in combat with the proper weapons, horsemanship, courage, and loyalty to one's lord, with courtliness, that is, the manners and behavior that would enhance a lord's court. And also medieval Christian values, at least the Christianity that was practiced by knights. Wealth was admired if rightly used.
Meaning what?
Meaning spending it on friends, feasts, and pageantry. Generosity was a core value, and one emphasized, for obvious reasons, by minstrels and household knights. A chivalrous knight used his wealth to honor his friends and his family, and to reward his household knights for their good service. That distinguished him from the merchant, who used money to make money, which is base and common. Merchants, moreover, acquired wealth ignobly through commerce, investment, and the sin of usury, in other words, banking. The honorable sources of wealth were land, lordship over the people who worked that land, the rewards that a lord would bestow upon a faithful vassal for his good services, marriage to an heiress, and the profits of war.
Are you trying to tell me that nobles in the 12th and 13th centuries really weren't trying to make money?
The reality is that in the 13th century, noblemen were very concerned about increasing their wealth, and they did it by hiring estate managers, by squeezing more rent from their peasant tenants, and by investing in new enterprises, such as forest clearance, in order to bring more land under the plow. Some nobles even invested in commerce. The great nobles of the lowlands and of Champagne in France made a fortune by taxing townsmen, by imposing tolls upon merchants traveling through their territories, and by collecting fees for the privilege of holding fairs, which have little in common with the modern version of medieval fairs. The fairs of Champagne, for example, were where merchants from Italy and Flanders could meet to exchange commodities. But this was not something to boast about. Capitalism was anathema to the chivalric ethos. Ironically, the greatest patrons of chivalry in the late 12th century were the counts of Flanders and Champagne, and that was because they were wealthy enough to support great courts, to host and participate in tournaments, and to be the patrons of troubadours.
If the great nobles were profiting from the commercial revolution of the 12th century, why the hostility toward merchants?
The social status of knights in the late 12th and 13th centuries was threatened by the rise of a wealthy merchant class in the growing towns and cities. Wealth in the early Middle Ages had been the surest indicator of noble rank. But the commercial revolution of the High Middle Ages changed that. Lesser nobles, suffering from the inflation of the late 12th century and the increasing expense of nobility, looked to the great barons for patronage and felt resentment against merchants and peasants alike. A successful merchant could afford the trappings of nobility, expensive clothing and food, better than these petty nobles, and certainly better than household knights. Chivalry is what separated a true nobleman from a jumped-up peasant. This hostility is well expressed in a poem by a late 12th century lesser noble, the really snarky troubadour Bertrand de Born, as he sang, "It pleases me immensely when I see rotten rich people suffer, the ones who make trouble for noblemen, and it pleases me when I see them destroy 20 or 30 from day to day, when I find them without clothes and begging for bread. If I'm lying, may my lady lie to me. A peasant has the habits of a pig, for he is bored by noble living. When a man rises to great riches, his wealth drives him mad. Whoever doesn't ruin his peasant sustains him in disloyalty. So a man's a fool who doesn't knock him down when he sees him climbing up, because once a peasant has established himself, once he entrenches himself in a very strong place, he has no peer in evil, for he spoils everything he can reach. For a peasant, so help me God, doesn't want to use what he has to help even his closest kin. Not for tears, not for pity, he naturally shuns any such deed. A low rascally gang, full of tricks and usury, pride and excess, you can't endure their deeds, for they toss God aside along with all loyalty and right. They do just as Adam did. God give them bad luck. Amen.
Bertrand was really a nice guy, wasn't he?
Bertrand was the medieval poet laureate of snarkiness and was notorious for his poems inciting the sons of King Henry II of England to revolt against him. Civil war was a great time for impoverished knights.
Well, Bertrand does mention his lady. So far, you've left out courtly love.
Yeah, courtly love. To be really pedantic about it, courtly love as a term is a modern invention, but it's a useful invention because the objects of troubadour songs about love and the medieval romancers are almost always the ladies in some noble's court. Noble women played a central role in chivalry as the objects of love and as the incentive for a knight to perform great deeds to enhance his reputation and be worthy of his lady. Countesses and queens also served as patrons of trouvères and troubadours. Chrétien de Troyes seems to have invented the Lancelot-Guinevere love affair at the suggestion of his patron, Marie de France, Countess of Champagne. Noble women were to be protected and wooed with poetry, deeds, and sweet words. Refined flirting was a chivalric skill.
So that was the medieval code of chivalry?
I think most of our listeners have heard about a code of chivalry, but code is really not the right word to describe chivalry.
Okay, then what was it?
Medieval chivalry was an evolving and contested ethos which kings and churchmen tried to co-opt. But it was the knights themselves in their daily practice and in the stories they favored which really defined what chivalry was. The idea of a single code is, in fact, a 19th century invention of those who tried to revive chivalry as the code of the gentleman. The original meaning of the word chivalry, Old French chevalerie, was a troop of horsemen, and by extension, the values and behaviors that were considered appropriate to that group. In the 11th century, chivalry was simply a martial ethos. It was the ethos of men who fought on horseback. But with the emergence of the great royal and comital courts in the 12th century, courtoisie, the behavior and values appropriate for court life, became tied to chivalry. Over the course of the second half of the 12th century and the early 13th century, writers of chivalric romances and epics and the knights themselves moved toward a vague consensus about what chivalry is. This vague consensus included a set of qualities generally acknowledged as enhancing the honor, that is, the public reputation of a knight, and necessary for that knight to be deemed a prud'homme, the most common term used to designate a true chivalric knight. These qualities were prowess, loyalty, courage, courtesy, mesure, which meant self-restraint, a concern for personal honor, and piety. Chivalric qualities, however, could and did come into conflict, and in those cases, which of them ought to take precedence was a matter of discussion and debate. Essentially, each medieval author of a romance, a chanson de geste, or handbook of chivalry had his or her own conception of what a perfect knight should be. The success of that author depended on how well he or she could convince the target audience, a noble court, of the rightness of that conception. Again, rather than think of chivalry as an established code, it is best to understand it as an evolving and disputed ethos that lacked a single agreed-upon meaning. The advocates of royal and clerical authority tried to shape it, but the ultimate shapes that it took in practice were due to the choices made by the knights themselves.
You say that the knights themselves defined what chivalry was. Can you give an historical example of a chivalric knight of the High Middle Ages?
That's a loaded question. I know whom you would choose, the English knight William Marshall.
Well, yeah, he was called the greatest knight in the world for a reason.
And I think William Marshall deserves an episode to himself. My choice for this episode is a more obscure early 13th century knight from southern Austria.
And so, without further gilding the lily, and with no more ado, I give to you the seeker of serenity, the protector of Italian virginity, the enforcer of our Lord God, the one, the only, Sir Ulrich von Liechtenstein!
Not that Ulrich von Liechtenstein of A Knight's Tale. I mean the real Ulrich von Liechtenstein. The film's screenwriter, director, and producer, Brian Helgeland, choice of that particular nom de guerre for the movie's hero, a commoner aspiring to be a tournament champion, is an Easter egg for medievalists. The real Ulrich is a more interesting and far weirder character. His story is a window on how at least some knights in the first half of the 13th century understood and maybe practiced chivalry.
Okay, who was this Ulrich von Liechtenstein?
He was a German knight from a lesser but quite wealthy noble family in the Duchy of Styria, which stretches over what is now southwestern Austria, parts of Slovenia, and, of course, the postage stamp country of Liechtenstein. Ulrich was born around 1200 and died in 1275, an unusually long lifespan for a layman of this era. He was a mover and shaker in the politics of the duchy and served the duke as seneschal of his court, marshal, which means leader of the horsemen of the court, and as a provincial judge. But the only reason Ulrich is known today is because he was a prolific Minnesinger. A Minnesinger, literally love singer, was the German version of the southern French troubadour and northern French trouvère. These were poet-musicians, some of whom came from the upper nobility, who composed at least the lyrics and often the music to love songs they performed. Their songs praised the beauty and virtue of a lady to whom they professed their love.
Never heard that before. Is that one of Ulrich's songs?
To be honest, I'm not overly fond of it, but it is one of Ulrich von Liechtenstein's songs. The singer is Clemens Bittmann, the violinist is Ulfried Steber. They term it an interpretation rather than a reconstruction. Ulrich would have both sang and accompanied himself, probably on the lute.
Why choose Ulrich von Liechtenstein rather than some other Minnesinger or troubadour?
What sets Ulrich apart from other Minnesingers is a truly eccentric work, the Frauendienst, the Service of Ladies, a collection of poems that he finished around 1255. The Service of Ladies is written as a first-person memoir recounting 2 treks he made in full costume accompanied by large entourages during which he challenged all good knights to joust with him. The first, which was undertaken when he was 26, was his Venusfahrt, his Venus tour, in which he dressed in drag as the Queen of Love and fought jousts along a route that took him from Venice to the modern-day Czech Republic. The second, undertaken 14 years later, was his Artusfahrt. Now costumed as King Arthur, he wandered around Austria seeking to joust with the best knights in each locale. Those who broke 3 lances jousting with him, he asked to join his round table. When the table was filled, he assembled them to participate in a round-robin tournament to prove who was the greatest knight of the round table. I often would say to my classes that the past is a foreign country. But in the case of Ulrich's Venusfahrt, it's more like an alien planet. Ulrich tells us that he fell in love, deeply, madly in love, at the age of 12 when he served as page to a lady of much higher noble birth. He was so taken with her that he even drank from her bathwater. After Ulrich was knighted at the age of 22, along with 249 other knights, at a wedding ceremony for the daughter of the Duke of Styria, he decided that he needed a lady love to be a truly perfect knight, and he chose this particular woman.
She must have been quite a bit older than he was if he had served her as a page. And wasn't she married?
Yep, she was an older married woman, and by the time he undertook his Venusfahrt in 1226, he was a married man. But courtly love had very little to do with marriage. Marriage was practical. Courtly love was romance. But how to win the heart of a woman that he couldn't even see in person? Fortunately, his aunt was close friends with the lady, and she offered to intercede on his behalf. She told the lady about this noble young man who was deeply in love with her and who wished to serve her as a knight. The lady responded that she couldn't accept the service of Ulrich because he had a hideous deformed lip, and it would be embarrassing to her to have a knight who looked like that serving her. Ulrich responded by undergoing medieval plastic surgery without anesthesia and without flinching even once, and 6 months later, when his lip was healed, he returned, and again his aunt went to the lady to tell the lady about the bravery of Ulrich in undergoing surgery on her behalf. The lady was unpersuaded, and Ulrich decided that he would demonstrate his love and his worthiness by becoming her champion in a series of tournaments. And Ulrich was a champion tournament knight. He won victory after victory, but in one of the tournaments, he injured a finger, apparently his pinky. The lady wasn't completely impressed, and was even less impressed when she discovered that a physician had healed the injured finger. Ulrich decided that he had to do something dramatic, and he did. He ordered his squire to cut off his finger. He wrote a little book of poetry to the lady, and he sent the book and the finger to her. The lady was impressed. She was impressed enough to keep the finger as a reminder that there was a knight who was willing to do this for her, but she still was not willing to give her love to Ulrich. Ulrich's response was the Venusfahrt. He sent out a messenger to all of the places that he intended to visit, giving them a time and place so that the local knights could come out and meet him and joust with him. In this letter, he laid out the terms of the Venusfahrt. If he defeated them, they were to bow to the 4 corners of the earth in honor of his lady. But if they were to break 2 lances with him, in other words, joust well against him, he would reward them with a gold ring. If a knight unhorsed him, he would give that knight all of his war horses. I should explain that in the 13th century, jousting was a bit like modern fencing. The object was not to kill or injure one's opponent, but one's skill as a horseman and a warrior. Jousting lances had blunted tips and were made of soft pine wood rather than ash. If a knight struck his opponent solidly with the lance, that lance would shatter. That was the next best thing to unhorsing one's opponent. When we hear the term medieval tournament, we immediately think of the joust. But in Ulrich's day, the feature event at a tournament was not a joust, but the melee. And the melee was a mock battle, fought in teams over an extensive area. It even included foot soldiers. The joust was to the tournament as a basketball shoot-around is to the actual game. Ulrich's Venice was a jousting tour, but it was a jousting tour that was punctuated by tournaments. To honor love and his lady, Ulrich transformed himself into the goddess Venus. He had several beautiful dresses made up for him, some that were large enough to fit over his armor, others that he could wear more casually. He also got a wig, and the wig had long braided pigtails. He made his challenge not in the name of Ulrich von Liechtenstein, but as Venus, the Queen of Love. He was traveling incognito. This was a motif in the medieval romances, and Ulrich was emulating those romances with his Venus font. He did unhorse several knights, among them one who was dressed as a monk. Initially, Ulrich refused to fight him because it was so unseemly for a knight to be dressed as a monk. He said this while he was in full Venus costume.
And where was his wife during all of this?
She was in their castle in Liechtenstein, overseeing the servants in his absence. In fact, when his Venus fought took him near his home castle, he decided to stop and pay a visit to his wife. This is how she greeted him, at least according to him. She greeted me just as a good and loving woman should always receive a husband she holds dear. That I had come to see her here had made her really very pleased. My visit stilled her grief and eased her loneliness. We shared our bliss, my sweet and I, with many a kiss. She was so glad to see her knight, and I had comfort and delight, till finally the third day came. To give me joy was her sole aim.
Does all of the Service of Ladies sound like it was written by Dr. Seuss?
Yes, I'm afraid it does. It might sound better in the Old High German, but I don't read Old High German, so I really can't tell you.
I can tell you now, I would not have been as understanding and loving.
I wouldn't expect you to be as understanding as Ulrich's unnamed wife apparently was.
Well, you did say that marriage had little to do with courtly love. Okay, back to the story.
The lady was impressed, but Ulrich still had improved himself sufficiently. She told him that she would receive him in her chambers at night, but in order to protect her reputation, this had to be done secretly. She required him to disguise himself as a leper, mingle with the lepers at the castle gate where they were begging for alms, and then hide in the bushes until nightfall, when he would be pulled up in a makeshift pulley. When he finally got into her chamber, instead of finding his lady love alone, he found the place crowded with women. He voiced his displeasure. Annoyed by his impertinence, the lady pretended that she would give him her favor, but not that evening. She held his hand, she gave him a kiss, and as he was being lowered, she let loose the rope, and he went tumbling into the moat. But Ulrich hadn't lost all hope. The lady sent a message that if he were to undertake a crusade on her behalf, then she would give herself to him. He joyfully agreed, and then she withdrew the offer. Finally, she did something so terrible that Ulrich ceased wooing her. As a gentleman, he won't tell us what it is, but my suspicion is that it was infidelity. Ulrich ends this part of the Frauendienst with the couplet, "Faithless love will never do. I must find a love that's true." That was his Venus thought.
The Service of Women sounds more like a Monty Python skit than any medieval romance I've read, and I've read a few of them. Surely Ulrich wasn't being serious.
I also thought that when I first heard about Ulrich. How could you not? But when I sat down and finally read The Service of Ladies, I realized that he was serious and was writing a handbook of sorts for other knights. The point was to emphasize how chivalrous he is. Most of the poem is taken up by his two jousting tours, his Venusfahrt and his Artusfahrt. In the Venusfahrt, he lovingly describes all the jousts he fought and won, boasting that he personally shattered 307 lances and gave out 271 rings to worthy adversaries over 5 weeks. Chivalry in the first half of the 13th century had at its heart prowess, skill in combat. The popular view of the Middle Ages is that it was a time of great violence, and it was a time of great violence. But Ulrich unfortunately lived in a time and place in which there was little warfare other than going on crusade, and the only way one could demonstrate one's prowess, one's worth as a knight, was in tournaments. Ulrich's Venus journey was purposely theatrical. It was meant to be remembered. Ulrich may have pretended to be a knight-errant, but he certainly didn't travel alone. Everywhere he went, he was surrounded with dozens of attendants, men, women, and musicians. He also had at least several carts filled with lances and with gold coins. What the Venus tour demonstrated is not only Ulrich's prowess, but also his great wealth and his generosity, giving away all of those gold rings. The Venus journey had less to do with honoring his putative lady love than it did with acquiring honor, that is, enhancing among other nobles.
And what should we make about the comic lengths which he went to win the heart of the lady?
There are undoubtedly comic elements in the service of ladies, but Ulrich's willingness to undergo medieval plastic surgery, chop off a pinky, dress as Frau Venus, and challenge all those knights to joust, dress as and mingle with lepers and suffer the indignity of having his chosen lady drop him into the moat, pledging to go on crusade in her honor, and do all of that without even getting more than a chaste kiss and a hand held, was evidence of his dedication to the service of ladies, even if this particular lady in the end turned out not to be properly appreciative or apparently properly faithful.
When Ulrich said that he wanted the lady's love, what did he mean by it?
Ulrich's attitude towards love and sex in the service of ladies is pretty strange. 19th century romantics like to stress that chivalric love was platonic, except, of course, for the adulterous affairs of Lancelot and Guinevere and Tristan and Isolde, neither of which turned out well. But Ulrich is clear that he expected his reward to be physical, despite the fact that both he and the lady were married. When he finally is allowed in the presence of the lady, he insistently pressures her to have sex with him. He persists after she tells him that she is a married woman and that her honor is at stake.
I thought that courtly love placed the lady on a pedestal. Pressuring his lady for sex doesn't sound much like putting her on a pedestal.
Worse, not only did he repeatedly beg her for this reward, but when she finally allowed him to climb up the castle wall and enter into her chamber, he found it filled with women to protect her from him forcing his attentions upon her, which he fully admits. I'll not contend with her a bit against her will, I'll admit. It's just that I know those here would very quickly interfere. If there weren't such a lot of you, I'd wrestle her. When we were through, she'd grant me the victory. I'll tell this is what would be.
Okay, medieval Dr. Seuss for adults, but seriously, this sounds a lot like rape.
It actually sounds a lot like Jacques Legree's version of what happened between him and de Carouge's wife in The Last Duel. A lady is expected to resist, but that is part of the game. The point is that Ulrich doesn't write this as a confession of his failings. It's too matter-of-fact. He's simply telling it like it is and expects his audience to approve.
I remember reading that courtly love was supposed to be pure and ennobling. As you said, courtly love had little to do with marriage because noble marriages were like the mergers of companies, and courtly love was love for its own sake.
I said before that chivalry wasn't a code but a contested ethos. The proper way to treat women was part of that. Troubadours and knights could write love songs in praise of the beauty and longing for the love of the wives of their lords, and household knights could imagine themselves as Lancelot or Tristan. There was status and prestige in imagining that a great lady might condescend to love them. But real adultery, that is, the adultery of a married countess or some other great lady, was a serious matter that a nobleman could not ignore or forgive. Being cuckolded meant the possibility that one's heir was not of one's blood, and there was nothing more shameful than that. Courtly love, as the romances term it, fin amour, fine loving, was for the most part a game played by courtiers to demonstrate a particular type of prowess, the prowess of elegant flirting. It was the reckless and foolish knight who took it too far. One of the great patrons of chivalry in the late 12th century was Philip of Alsace, Count of Flanders. He was the patron of Chrétien de Troyes, the author of Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, which introduced the story of Lancelot and Guinevere. Apparently, one of Philip's household knights took that story too seriously and had sex with Philip's wife. Philip had him stripped and tied up. At dawn, he released him to make a break for freedom, and then had his other knights hunt him down like a stag. And after being caught and mauled by the dogs, Philip turned him over to the kitchen staff to beat. He then had the still living unfortunate knight hung upside down in a latrine until he died. Of course, Philip himself was free to have as many sexual affairs as he wanted, and married women, if they were commoners, were fair game. A prudent household knight knew the difference between romantic fantasy and real life.
It looks like we're out of time, and you still haven't talked about courage, warfare, restraint, the practice of courtliness within a court, knightly piety, or even loyalty to a lord.
You're right. And what you've made is a really strong argument that our next episode should be about your favorite knight, William Marshal, the greatest knight in the world. Marshal demonstrated all of those chivalric qualities that are missing from the service of ladies. Marshal's practical chivalry is a good balance for Ulrich's theatrical chivalry. So on to William Marshal.